Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the GSMC Relationship Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today in our episode, we're going to talk about how to fight, specifically how to fight smarter. So today's topic was inspired by the podcast Unlocking Us, hosted by Dr. Brené Brown. And she's a brilliant research professor and New York Times bestselling author who is best known for her TED Talks about the power of vulnerability and listening to shame. So I was listening to a podcast, as you do, and Dr. Brené was discussing the difference between shame, guilt, and accountability. And it really got me thinking, like, if I had known the difference between all these terms and feelings, I could have really saved myself and my partner from a lot of fights. And so today we're going to just talk about the why and how to fight smarter. And at the end of the episode, I'll talk about specific exercises you can do with your partner to help you fight smarter. So make sure you stick around for that because it's a practical application of information I'm going to have for you guys today. So with that, let's get started. The first article is actually called How to Fight Smarter, and it's from the Gottman Institute. And if you don't know what that is, it's a research-based approach to relationships. Gottman is like the number one relationship expert that other psychologists go to because Gottman's been around for a really long time, has done a lot of research on relationships, like partnerships, romantic relationships, and relationships between parents and their children. So basically, all research-based approaches to relationships have been done by the Gottman Institute for forever. So we're starting with an article called How to Fight Smarter, and the first line of the article is just, it already hits home, like it's a home run, I mean, like right off the bat. So maybe I have all these baseball references because baseball's not here. Probably. But anyways, the article says, starts off with, softening the startup of your arguments and complaints is crucial to resolving relationship conflicts. So let me just reiterate that again because it's a concept that you might not be familiar with, but it's softening your startup. So they say softening your startup of your arguments is crucial to resolving relationship conflicts. And then they go into what the study was and then explain what that means. So the study was a 6-year longitudinal study performed by John Gottman and his research assistant. They discovered that they could predict the likelihood of a couple's divorce by observing just 3 minutes of conflict discussion. So they said the couples who divorced started their discussions with a great deal of negative emotion and displayed far fewer expressions of positivity than those who stayed together 6 years. So not only were those couples who divorced negative towards each other, but they were also critical of each other. Their research also revealed that discussions will end on the same note they begin. So if you begin your arguments harshly by attacking your partner, you'll end up with at least as much tension as you begin with, if not more. So they recommend to soften the startup of your conversation, and they say that it's crucial to do so because then you end up resolving the relationship conflicts because, again, you're going to start the way you end. or you're going to end the way you began. My mistake. So that's why it's a soft startup. So a little statistic that they mentioned here is 94% of the time, the way a discussion starts determines the way it will end. So that's almost 100%. And I think that's really insane. So that is why we're going to focus on how to fight smarter, is to recognize, statistics like this first. Like, we need to know the history of fights and how they continue and how conflict continues. And then we're going to go into some specifics, like I said, at the end about how to actually pragmatically figure out what you're doing wrong, how it leads to a fight, and exercises you can do with your partner so that it doesn't lead into a fight. So, but back to this article, the Gottman article, it says, how does a soft startup work? Like, what does it look like? So they say to think of it this way. If someone comes to you with a legitimate complaint, but they don't blame you or don't come off as critical, you won't feel attacked and you won't feel the need to go on the defensive. Because there isn't an overt negativity in their tone or their words, you're more likely to be receptive of their concerns and needs. So they give a couple examples. So they say, perhaps you fell behind at work and your manager comes to you and says, hey, I needed this done sooner. We agreed on a deadline for yesterday. Please get that to us as soon as you can. That's a soft startup. That's an example of one. So they have it compared to like a harsh setup. Where are the reports you said you'd file? Could you for once get something done on time? So obviously there's a huge difference there. And at work, we don't approach, like, I would really hope you don't approach your boss like that or your employees with such a negativity, right? But there's a difference in tone and approach, and a soft startup at its most basic function serves to protect both you and your partner from feeling either attacked or defensive. So this is a proven way to bring up a legitimate disagreement, concern, issue, complaint, or need without blaming your partner or judging their character. So what does this look like? There are a couple, I think there's about 5 different ways to approach a soft startup to get you practical advice for how to do this. So when you bring up an issue of disagreement with your partner, the first recommendation is to complain, but don't blame. So this is hard to do because when we're already in that state of complaining, we usually have all of that negativity really built up in us already. We're ready to unleash our stress and our anger in like probably a verbally, like we're going to attack, right? So they say, no matter how at fault you feel that your partner is, approaching them with criticisms and accusations is not productive, obviously. What isn't obvious, however, are the little things you might say in arguments with your partner that make them feel criticized or blamed. So your body language, like eye rolling, is an example of unintentional but destructive behavior. So it's really about how you approach the issue. So instead of blaming your partner with, you said you would clean the backyard today and it's still a mess, try a different complaint. Say, hey, there's still some leaves in the gutter in the yard. We agreed that you'd rake and clean up. I'm really upset about this. Can you make sure it's taken care of? So I really like that approach because it still allows you to complain. It doesn't invalidate what you're upset about. What it says is, yes, you're upset about something. Yes, you have the right to complain, but no, you don't have the right to shame your partner about it. You don't have the right to be passive aggressive and just assume they know what you're thinking. It's saying, yes, complain, but complain and be productive about it, right? You want to make sure that you're not just having a source of release of stress for yourself. There's a reason why you're saying it out loud, and it's to address the issue and get it fixed. So go ahead and complain, but make sure it's productive. Okay, so the next tip for how to do a soft startup for an argument is make statements that start with I instead of you. Now, this is a really common thing you learn in therapy, so you may have heard it before, but repetition just helps you remember in the heated moment that this is what you should be doing instead of, focusing on what you're angry about. So when you start sentences with I, you're less likely to be critical, which, as we know from criticism, will immediately put your partner on the defensive. So instead of saying, you're not listening to me, you can say, I don't feel heard right now. Instead of saying, you're so careless with money, say, we're a little tight on our budget and I think we should try and save more. Focus on how you're feeling and what you need, not on accusing your partner. That'll also help you relieve the tension. This is not in the article, but having done this myself and practiced it myself in my own relationships, by focusing on your needs, you're no longer focusing on how angry you are at that partner. You're focusing on, I need this, I want this is how it needs to get done, or this is what I think should get done. So it helps you get your anger out without actually being accusatory or without progressing the fight. So again, just to reiterate, by focusing on what you're feeling and what you need, you both stand to gain something from the conversation. You'll likely feel that you're hearing and understanding each other more, hopefully. And one more very important point is that using an I statement isn't an excuse to say something like, I feel like you never listen to me. That's still harsh. It still blames your partner, and you're still using you. So remember to stick with pure I statements as much as possible. Okay, so the next step to a soft startup is describe what is happening, but don't evaluate or judge. So instead of accusing or blaming your partner, simply describe what you see and feel in the situation. Instead of attacking with accusations, such as, you never watched the baby, try saying, I seem to be the only one chasing after the baby today. Now, that sounds a little passive-aggressive, but again, if you're sticking to I statements and you have to get out some of that frustration, they say it's actually beneficial to say something like that, even though I find it really hard to agree with it, but they're the scientists here, so I'm going to roll with it. They said, instead of counterattacking and lashing out at you, your partner is more likely to consider your point of view and what you need, and they will likely try harder to deliver the results you're hoping for with this approach. So something like, I seem to be the only one doing this, apparently will make your partner feel less attacked. But they reiterate, just be clear. No matter how long you've been with your partner or how well they know you, you can't expect them to read your mind. So make sure that you're expressing your needs in a positive way. All right, so the fourth one for how to do a soft startup, they say to be polite and appreciative. So just because you're in conflict with your partner doesn't mean that you respect and have affection for them any less. By adding phrases such as please and I appreciate it, that's helpful for maintaining warmth and emotional connection during a difficult conversation. This is, of course, like exactly why you need it most. Like, remember to be kind. This is like the hardest thing to do when you're upset about something. But just remember during conflict that you want to keep like a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions. So that's a good rule of thumb for expressing appreciation and keeping a positive attitude, even when in the middle of an argument. So the whole reason for this topic, for how to fight smarter, so that we can get tools in a repertoire that become patterns so that we create that 5-to-1 ratio. Like, I don't know about you, but the fights that I have with partners, whether it's with the partner I have now or with previous partners, in all relationships, you develop these negative patterns when you do fight, and the same topics come up over and over and over again. And I want to do that less. I want to have a better pattern of more positive ways to have conflict with a partner because it's unavoidable. So that's exactly what this is saying. Like, you want to make sure that even in the hardest of times, you're being as positive as possible because it'll create a pattern of that. And then you'll have less animosity when you do fight because your brain's not reacting to that same stressor of a fight's coming up. Oh my God, there's going to be conflict. Like, do I fight, flight, or freeze? You know? So you want to create the opposite pattern and create the pattern of kindness and appreciation. Alrighty. So the last piece of information that they have for how to do a proper startup for a conversation is don't store things up. Okay, so we've all heard this before, don't let it all build up, talk as you go, but as it says, we've all been there. We're exhausted and overwhelmed, especially right now during quarantines. And we're feeling like we're drowning in a whirlpool of our own emotions, and one issue just keeps leading to another. So we bottle up our feelings and our needs, and we suddenly find ourselves like bringing up a laundry list of problems we never intended to broach. Well, somehow they just all start to feel related. It just all builds up, and I know that we've all been there. And then you eventually blow up, like it all just comes out at once, and that's not good either. So when they say when you're flooded with emotion, both parties are capable of reaching a resolution regardless if you're flooded with emotion. Don't put off bringing up an issue with your partner, and your conflict discussions will be far more productive because it's just that little issue one at a time. Now, I will say that I have tried to implement this and did it incorrectly, because what would happen is that every day I'm picking on something. I'm picking on something I do not like about my partner so that I make sure it doesn't all just come out at once. And now I'm left with the situation of, wait, now my partner is getting attacked, quote unquote attacked, or, having to improve something I don't like, every day. Now that's a really sucky position to be in, and I quickly realized that it wasn't working. So what I will add to this from personal experience is, of course, don't load up and let it get pent up and, blow up at your partner. But at the same time, don't do it a little bit each day. My recommendation would to be just stick to what you're actually angry about. Really question if there's evidence for what you're angry about. So that's very easy to do if it's a practical thing you are angry about. Okay, they said they would do the dishes and they didn't do the dishes. So that's something very practical, and in the moment you can address with your partner, say, hey, we agreed that you do the dishes today and you haven't, and I'd really like them done by the end of by 5 p.m. Give them a specific boundary. Otherwise, they can think today ends at midnight and then just not do them until after you've gone to bed. But that's not exactly what you wanted. So my recommendation is, of course, not to do it all at once. And if it's chore specific, that's easy enough. But if it is a vague something that you're telling your partner that I need you to be more connected to me, before you tell them something like that, make sure the argument is productive. Make sure your needs are obtainable and they're small goals. So if you're feeling really neglected by your partner lately, they're busy with work, they don't have time to help you around the house, and it's been like that for a while and it's driving you crazy, if it's a bigger issue like that, then I would say break down specifics. Say, you aren't helping me, or say, I need your help with A, B, and C. Let's agree on these things getting done, and by whom by this time. So if it's a feeling rather than a situation that you're upset about with your partner, do it all at once because you've done the work to figure out what your needs are, if that makes sense. If it's a general feeling of loneliness, or if it's a general feeling of you're feeling underappreciated, you can take a day to talk to your partner about that, plan it out for yourself. But when you plan that out, make sure that you've broken down why you feel that way, focus on I statements, and then focus on a practical solution to getting those feelings and needs met versus just blowing up. So I do think it can be done on a day versus taking little things here and there all the time, every single day. That's a lot for your partner. So I say just keep that in mind when you're taking these steps into account. So they also go into what if a soft startup doesn't work for an argument. So they just give an example, say you've approached your partner with a soft startup, but they respond with negativity. They immediately go on the defensive or blame you or counterattack. What do you do? So when you're faced with negativity, you try and say something like, I'm not trying to criticize you here or put you down. That's not what I want to do. I really care about you and I really want to be closer to you. So again, focusing on I statements, what you're looking to do with this argument, your goal, and then remind them that you're not criticizing them. It can really help de-escalate the situation. Also, I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about Brene Brown, because she gives like step-by-step advice about what defensiveness looks like, how to recognize it, and how to move on from there and have a successful argument. So stick around for that. But yeah, I'm hoping that you guys learn something about how to at least start a fight in a positive note. Just to sum it up real quick, these are just steps for how to have a soft startup, making sure that you're positive because the fight's going to end the way that it started. So make sure that you complain but don't blame. You want to make I statements instead of you statements, so you're not criticizing them. You want to make sure that you describe what is happening, but you don't add judgment to it. You want to make sure that you're polite and appreciative. And you also don't want to store things up, but you also don't want to spread things out. So make sure you know exactly what your needs are and that they're specific and productive enough that your partner can take them without criticism. Okay? And then again, I'm going to talk about Brene Brown and her specifics on what if that doesn't work? How do you control the situation? And how do you move on? And so yeah, make sure you join us for our next segment and we can talk about that then. But right now, we're going to take a break. So I'll see you guys after the break.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the GSMC Relationship Podcast. So before the break, we talked about how to fight smarter and what that even means, and starting with a soft start, a positive start to a fight so that it can end positively as well. And I teased that I was going to talk about Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown, and I am going to do that, but that is going to be segment 3. So for this segment, we're actually going to talk about thinking traps, what they are, how they add to conflict, and how to work through them so that you don't get caught up in that during a fight. And don't forget, at the end of the episode, I'm going to give you guys specific exercises that you can do with your partner so that you start and end a fight in a productive and happy way, honestly. Okay, so right now we're going to go into thinking traps and what they are and how they add to fights. So thinking traps, I got these articles from my therapist and I thought I'd share them with you guys. So a thinking trap is how our minds allow us to predict, remember, and organize and evaluate information. So these cognitive processes make it possible for humans to do everything they do, from having a conversation to building skyscrapers. But they also lead us into mental traps that contribute to stress, disconnect us from others, and make our lives more difficult. So all of these things that allow us to predict, remember, organize, and categorize and evaluate, those are called thinking traps. And here are some examples of some thinking traps. Okay. Probability overestimation. So it's overestimating the probability that something negative will happen. So it's basically being half empty, like the glass is half empty. But the example they give is you believe that you're in danger of being fired despite no indication to support your belief. Or if it's for a relationship, you believe that you're in danger of being broken up with, even though there's no evidence to support that. It's probability overestimation. You're too forward thinking. You're too future thinking. You're not present. The next one it lists is catastrophizing. So you're overestimating the consequences of something negative happening. And what this looks like is, the example they gave is, you imagine that if you get a bad review or if your project isn't approved, you won't be able to handle it. You won't be able to emotionally process that feeling of failure, probably is the feeling there. So there's an example of catastrophizing. You're overgeneralizing and aggrandizing whatever the consequences are going to be, and in a negative way, not in a positive way. All right. Another example of a thinking trap is all or nothing thinking. So we see things in black and white. They're either good or they're all bad. There's no in between. So an example of when you do this is a difficult situation arises. You only see the negative aspects and none of the solutions or opportunities that it presents. And there's a couple more I want to go over here because everyone experiences negative feelings or negative future thinking in a different way. And that's what the majority of these thinking traps are, is like how you think negatively and you're not in the moment. So another way of doing this is should statements. So you have rigid rules for how the world should operate and for how people, including yourself, should think, feel, and behave. So an example of telling yourself that is like, things shouldn't be this way, or I shouldn't feel so stressed. Like, let's say that your partner's not helping around the house, like I gave that example before, and you start to think, things shouldn't be this way. For example, I give this example in the previous segment, like let's say your partner isn't helping you around the house, and then you just have the thought like, things shouldn't be this way. Like they should know to already help me because I care for them in this way. How come they don't want to care for me in this way? So you really go to a different place when you start thinking the shoulds, because we know this outside of the context of our relationship, but there's no such thing as should, right? So try and get that out of your line of thinking, but I'll continue with the thinking traps and then I'll go into differences and how those thinking traps affect dating and relationships. So other things we tend to do are personalization. So you overestimate your influence on negative effects, taking things really personally. So when your partner is unhappy, you feel like it's all your fault. You place the blame on yourself. I know I've been with partners who tend to do this a lot. They, like, you're mentioning something that you're upset about and they say sorry for no reason at all. I know I've done that as well. You're taking the blame on yourself for no reason, and you're overestimating your influence like in a negative way. Why would, there's some scenarios where you don't need to apologize at all, but you're doing it anyway. And it's because you're assuming the worst. So something we can get into. I will only do a couple more. There's 5 more. I'll just read them off and we'll kind of go through them as quickly as I can. But the next one is mind reading and fortune telling. So I've done this one before. You're assuming you know what people are thinking and what will happen in the future. So an example of that is like you're certain you know a colleague or a loved one's motivations, and you're sure your children's lives will be unhappy if they don't get into the right school. It's like you are so convinced that you know what the outcome is going to be that you're not focused on the conflict that's in the present. So that's a thinking trap. Another thinking trap is it's just not fair. So you're over-focusing on whether things are just or right. Like some examples of that, it's like, it's not fair that other people don't have the same health problems I do, or it's not right that someone else got the job I wanted. And I know we grow up learning that life isn't fair, but sometimes it just piles on and it's really hard not to feel that way. So obviously it's going to be listed here as a thinking trap. The next one is if only. So you overfocus on an imagined outcome as the solution to all your problems. So let's say that you are unemployed right now and you think that by getting employed, it's going to fix all of your problems with your partner right now. Like financially, sure, it could help, but it's not going to solve all the emotional things that you guys have going on at home, like that financial stress causes too, because financial stress isn't just about money. It's about responsibility. It's about accountability. So you have those underlying issues there too that it's really not going to fix. So there's not one fix to every problem. The last 2 are emotional reasoning, which is basing your interpretation solely on your emotional reactions. So the example is, I feel anxious, therefore something bad must be happening. just make sure it's evidence-based. If you have an emotional reaction to something, make sure there's previous history, like a whole history of something happening before you get accusatory and before you like emotionally respond. Okay, and the last one is thoughts are what they say they are. So treating thoughts like facts, like this is the one that blew my mind. Like, your thoughts are not facts. So an example of that is that you think a friend is mad at you and therefore you assume that's true. Like, oh, they must be mad at me. And I think they're mad at me because I yelled at them the other day. You don't know what your friend has going on in their life. Like, up to a point, of course you do. But just because you think that they're mad at you doesn't mean that they are mad at you. You have to, again, get evidence and a history of that. And like, have you yelled at them before for this exact action? Have they been mad at you before for yelling at them? Or are they the type of person to understand that you react in certain ways when you're angry, but you don't mean it? So they're probably over it by now and you're overthinking it. So that's definitely a thinking trap that I've done before. Okay, so now that we have a general understanding of what a thinking trap is, I want to go over specific thinking traps in dating. So I'm going to list off thinking traps that can get in the way of building meaningful relationships, and each one is a mindset that limits the way we engage with potential partners. So after each trap is an alternative mindset, one that is more effective for getting what we want out of love. So I'll read the mind trap and then it's going to specify the alternative to that trap. And I think this is really important to know if you're trying to establish a relationship and establish like healthy conflict management. But also, if you're already with your partner, these are really helpful as well. There's another Thinking Traps article for relationships specifically. And if we have like already established relationships, and if we have enough time for that, I'll make sure to go over it as well. Okay, so the first thinking trap, it lists the thinking trap for dating, is the concealing trap. So it says, for the explanation, I need to conceal parts of myself and withhold my truth in order to feel safe enough to be in a relationship. I need to construct an ideal version of myself to engage future partners. So for me, this might include something like, oh, I'm not going to reveal that I like tarot and astrology, because those are two things that can either be a conversation starter or a conversation ender. So an alternative to maybe hiding that from a potential partner would be, I can meet each dating experience with openness and honesty, be myself, and reveal my truth. I can be honest, even if it puts a relationship at risk. I can be real. I don't need to ignore my feelings. Now, these are all really hard alternatives. They're the best possible outcome. But what I take from learning that is that, of course, it's important to be myself. And if astrology and tarot are something I'm really interested in, and whoever I was starting to date seemed disinterested in it, I'd have to evaluate how important it was to me. But I at least have to give them the opportunity to judge it, right? I have to give them the opportunity to either be open to it or to judge it, and then to judge for myself whether or not I'm comfortable with that person's stance on something that I love and something that makes me me. So it's just a good reminder that you can meet people with everything that you are, and you can live through the experience of them denying it. You can. You truly can. It's important to do that because eventually it's going to come up, and if they're truly uncomfortable with it, where do you go from there? Okay, so the next thinking trap in dating is the impediments trap. Now, this one is interesting. Okay, so the impediments trap is, the explanation is, the relationships I've had were mistakes and now I have baggage. They're impediments to finding the right one, quote unquote, right one. The alternative thinking to that is that I can learn and grow from past relationships, and each has given me an opportunity to get to know myself better. I will bring that knowledge and growth to future relationships. So again, sounds easier said than done, but if you remember that it's a trap to think that your past is a load on you and a baggage on you, in that moment you can recorrect and just say, no, they give me knowledge and growth. Like, I can move forward from this. It does not have to hold me back. Okay, so then there's the responsibility trap. And this is defined as like by saying my partners or future partners are responsible for completing me. meeting my emotional needs, and making me happy. Now, to an extent, I mean, that's kind of true. I mean, you don't want to be with someone who's not meeting your emotional needs all the time, but the alternative to this is like you're in control of your life and your fulfillment really depends on you. So you can depend on your partner for love and support, but it's not their responsibility to complete you or make you happy. So there's the difference there. The next trap we can fall into is the mind reading trap. And so the definition of that is my partners or future partners are responsible for knowing what I want and anticipating my desires without having me to tell them. That's what makes up a true loving relationship. And I have to say, this one's kind of a hard one for me as well, especially because I read a lot of romance. Now, romance novels are great for showing you what safe and consenting love and respectful love looks like. I actually really recommend, if you're struggling with intimacy, to read romance novels because they can teach you practical advice for how to have a relationship. And that might sound absurd, except modern romance has really changed from the Fabio days in the 1980s, where it was more aggressive and alpha males, and we veered away from billionaire playboys. So now we're on to romance that has like consenting adults, and it's not that problematic. So I'd recommend romance novels for sure. But it does create this expectation. Sometimes it's like your partner should know how you feel, but that's not true. And how would they possibly know how you feel? So the alternative is just saying that I'm responsible for informing my partner about what I want, what emotions I'm feeling, and what's important to me. Again, knowing your needs is so important. So remember that no one can read your mind, and a successful relationship requires communication, which requires you to tell your partner what you need. Okay, so these last two are actually really important. The second to last one is called the truth trap. So my perspective is reality, and anyone who disagrees with me is wrong. How I interpret the behavior of others is the only perspective that matters. Now, I don't really resonate with that second part. I don't think my interpretation is like the only one that matters, but I do really sometimes fall into that trap of like my perspective is reality, because I feel like I try really hard to understand my partner, and I try really hard to understand other people's feelings and take that into consideration. I do try and be a good listener. I'm into all that like self-help relationship like podcasts, which is why I'm doing this one. But so I really struggle with that one. And it really helps to remember this alternative, is that my view of the world and relationships is valid, but so are the views of others. And it's not the only view to have. I'm curious about my relationships, and I can grow and learn from each new relationship and from the different perspectives other people have to offer. So I think for me personally, it's not that I like invalidate anyone else's feelings. It's mostly that I'm so caught up in my own that I forget that other people's perspectives could be just as strong and truthful as mine. Okay, so the next one is super important, at least to me. This is the one that is obviously noticeable throughout any relationship that I've observed, whether I'm involved in it or not, but it's the victim trap. And it's when you say that you're a victim of the circumstances of your love life, like you being single or your partner breaking up with you. It's like you're a victim, and you're like, it's their fault that you're in this situation. And an alternative way to look at that is like, you're responsible for your behavior and your relationships, and you can do your best to connect with people and build relationships, but sometimes they don't work out, and you can't control that. But that doesn't mean that you've been wronged. It just means that you're responsible for getting to know your own patterns of behavior and using that knowledge to improve your next relationship. So if you're single and you're like, I've tried everything, there's no doubt that you have. But there's certain things that are outside of your control. So it doesn't mean that the world is against you. It just means that circumstances haven't worked out to let you have a relationship, and just focus on yourself until a person does come along that matches your standards, matches your needs, and you can just have fun with. Alrighty, so that's it for the thinking traps that you can do in dating. I really do want to go over thinking traps, specifically if you're already in a relationship, and then how to challenge thinking traps. So what I'm going to do is actually save those for the end of the podcast. I'll circle back to those. Yes, I'm that circle back person, and it drives me crazy too. But yeah, I'll go back to the thinking traps that you can do in relationships and how to challenge those thinking traps. And then at the very end of the episode, I'll go into specific examples of different exercises you can do as a practical example of how to fight smarter. Wow, I keep wanting to say smart fighter, but be a smart fighter too. So yeah, I will see you guys after the break, and we're going to talk about Brené Brown and how to distinguish shame and how to de-escalate a fight.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to the GSMC Relationship Podcast. So far in this episode, we've talked about how to fight smarter, how to be a smart fighter, if you will. Also how to start conversations or arguments in a positive way so that they end in a positive way. And then some of the thinking traps we can get into that even start fights in the first place. So now in this segment, we're going to talk about how Dr. Brené Brown, how she says fights start occurring, but how to focus on yourself and maybe even prevent it altogether. All right, so we're going to talk about conflict prevention. And I got all this information from Brené Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us, and the title of the podcast, or the episode, was Shame and Accountability. Now, in this episode, she does talk about how we feel shame and accountability in relation to what's going on with race in America right now, but I thought it was really applicable to relationships, and I'll explain why. So in relationships, we experience conflict, and we can experience that moment where we feel attacked. And so she is saying that when you feel attacked, you feel shame. And what you do when you go into shame is you have these types of defensive responses that she calls armoring up. And I'll go into more detail about exactly what that looks like in a minute. Before I go into what that looks like, I think it's important to address the shame that comes with being defensive, because once we feel shame, we're unable to empathize, and then we focus less on the issue our partner is actually addressing, and we go into defense mode. So if you're ever wondering, like, when conflict happens, when it's starting, like why you go into defense mode, it's because you're feeling shame. And I'll explain what that looks like right here. So when you are feeling attacked by your partner, you're going to go into a sense of shame. And that's the first step in the armoring up process. It's the first step in the defense mode. And so first you feel shame because you start thinking, like, for example, if they tell you you're on your phone too much, you're not paying attention to them. Well, the first thing you're going to feel is really bad. You're going to feel really bad for letting them down in some way. But then eventually right after that, and these are all a quick succession of feelings and thoughts, when you're experiencing shame, the next thought after that is, oh, well, hang on, if I'm honest about like why I am on my phone too much, that person can hold this truth against me inevitably forever, like within the length of time of this relationship. So you don't want to be honest about it because you're worried about being attacked again. And then from there, you just spiral downward. You just think about like, well, why do I need to be honest about why I'm on my phone too much? They're not honest about why they do what they do when I get upset. I don't ask them to like be on their phone less. And then you evolve to screw them. They have plenty of their own issues. I'm just fine. They're just picking on me for no reason. And then you lead to, this is their problem. They're just sensitive, some name calling in your head. And then you end on, well, now that I think about it, I'm better than them anyway. Like, sure, I might be on my phone all the time, but at least I do the dishes. Like, you start a comparison and then you start the blame game. And then you could potentially even start a fight that you weren't even fighting about in the first place just because you feel attacked. So Brene says that it's important for you to recognize that you're going through the symptoms of shame. So I wanted to give you what shame actually like materializes, like how it works in your head and how you end up becoming defensive. But the next sign is like, let's say again, you feel attacked by just one comment that your partner made. You're on your phone too much. The next thing you can do to kind of recognize the state of shame that you're going into so you don't get to the blaming part of it is to recognize your physical attributes of what happens when you go into shame. So, it's important to know this because in one of her studies, the people with the highest resilience to shame and becoming defensive were the people who physically recognized when they were in shame. So do you sweat? Does your mouth get dry? Do you see red? So by first recognizing like how your body's responding when you feel a fight coming on, you can be preventative and recognize like, okay, my body is going into like hyperactive mode. I feel uncomfortable. I don't like this feeling. Okay, why don't I like this feeling? Am I going into shame? Am I armoring up, as she calls it? So basically what you're going to do is to move past shame and defensiveness. First, take responsibility for regulating your own emotional experience of shame, like, recognizing when you're armoring up, and then recognizing when you go into defense mode and if you're playing the blame game. So it's basically, just to sum it up real quick, you want to make sure that you're recognizing if you're going into defense mode, and that's with your thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then what you want to do is recognize your blind spot indicators. So just like you have blind spot indicators in your car that like warn you, danger, Will Robinson, like you're about to approach your max capacity for being attacked by your partner. And it's important to recognize what those indicators are because you do have them. So she gives examples of what her blind spot indicators are that help warn her that she's going into the feeling of shame, regardless of if she's noticed her body or regardless of if she's noticed her pattern. So a blind spot indicator would be the thought that it's gone too far, like you feel pushed to your limit. I'm sure it's a thought we've all had in our relationships, like how dare they? It's kind of the thought of like, whoa, this is going too far. I haven't actually done anything this wrong. Why are they attacking me? And then the second blind spot indicator for her, the second question is, why are you making me feel bad? So again, it is like the blaming thing, but that's her specific question that she asks, like, why are you making me feel bad? And it's really important for you to know what yours are. I think my blind spot indicators are kind of like, where is this coming from? That would be my first question. And then my second blind spot indicator would be like, well, I don't see you doing anything. So that would be, if I have those thoughts, I immediately have to backtrack and be like, whoa, am I feeling ashamed of, am I feeling attacked right now? Like, am I going into defense mode? And then, if I am going into defense mode, the first thing she recommends to do is to say the mantra, I'm here to get it right, not be right. And I think that really sets us up perfectly for what I mentioned at the top of the episode for soft starters, because I'm not going to go immediately from the shaming thought, when I feel attacked of like, why are they bringing this up anyway, immediately to, here, let me do a soft starter to eliminate, or to make this conflict positive and positively. No one thinks that way. So I think it's really helpful to have a mantra like she does, about getting it right versus being right. I think that's really important, because if you have that small little like mantra, then it helps you reset and be like, okay, if I'm going to get this right, how do I do this? What are the steps? And then the steps are just the soft startup, like starting with I comments, or, making it a non-judgmental comment about what you need. So it really helps you when you recognize your shame and your triggers for that, whether they are thoughts, whether they are physical attributes, to help prevent a fight. So if you start to feel shame, basically Dr. Brene found that change in action is the best cure for the shame we experience around accountability. So if your partner is asking you to be accountable for, let's say you're on your phone too much, like I used before, how do you move past that? It's action. You have to regain control over your accountability with action. And you can easily do this just by asking questions of, what am I going to do differently this time? Or how am I going to show up differently so that my partner is not upset with this action again? What choices can I make to be accountable for what I'm being accused of? Do I come up with a new schedule of when I'll do the dishes? Do I actually plan a no-go zone for phones so that when I'm in this area, I'm not tempted to pick up my phone? So to sum up just how to get out of defensiveness, you're going to recognize the physical signs of how you armor up, recognize your thoughts, and if you're in armor mode, and then you're going to remember the mantra, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. And then ask yourself how you can do it differently the next time. So how to really prevent conflict is to remember that when you feel, how you feel attacked, why you feel attacked, the levels of shame, and then how to reroute with your mantra and how to move forward with positive action. So I thought that was really applicable to relationships, even if she wasn't talking about them, because shame is such a huge part of why we get defensive and fights happen when you're defensive. Now, fights can happen when you're not defensive, but that's like 1% of the time. And most of the time we just feel attacked, so we attack back. But yeah, I thought this would be a good way to understand why we fight in the first place, to give us some preventative measures in order to stop a conflict. And then if the conflict arises, that's when we have the soft starters, and it kind of circles back into that. And it circles back into the thinking traps. Like, is this a thinking trap? Do I need to get myself out of this situation? How do I stop feeling the shame and defensiveness? So I hope you guys like that. I thought it was really interesting. And don't forget, at the end of the episode, right after this break, I'm going to be talking about specific exercises you can do with your partner that will start positively and end positively. So stick around for that after the break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello, and welcome back to the GSMC Relationship Podcast, where on this episode, we're talking about how to fight smarter. And while in the beginning of the episode, we've talked about, different practices for how to start a positive fight to end a positive fight, to recognize your own defense mechanisms and where it begins so you can prevent conflict. And now we're going to talk about some more thinking traps that we could fall into in relationships, how to challenge those thinking traps, and then specific exercises you can do with your partner that help you have healthy conflict and conflict resolution. So let's get into those thinking traps. And just as a reminder, thinking traps are just beliefs about the way relationships should be and how our partners should behave. And while all of this is normal, these views can really make us rigid in how we respond, and it leads to unrealistic standards and expectations, inaccurate assumptions, and repeated conflict. So here are some of the thinking traps that can get in the way of intimacy and being connected to your partner. The first one is jumping to conclusions. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have been known to do that before. And basically, just a quick rundown of what that means is just making assumptions about your partner without any history or evidence. You know, you say that your partner is uncharacteristically quiet the first time he meets your family, so you assume he doesn't like them. But again, is there evidence to support that he doesn't like your family? Now, if there is, use the tools that I give you to have a positive, conflict conversation, but just don't try and jump to those conclusions. The second trap that we can fall into is magnifying and minimizing. So what we can tend to do with our partners is magnify certain aspects of their behavior and minimize all others. So, for example, you can focus on your partner's failure to ask about your day, but ignore all the other caring things that your partner might do. Now, this next one's pretty huge. A lot of people do this one too. Overgeneralization. You use one incident to describe your partner's behavior in general. For example, your partner forgets your anniversary and subsequently you perceive him as neglecting all aspects of your relationship. So that one small act, because it means so much to you, you just apply that to everything else in your relationship, but that's not fair, is it? And is there history and evidence of that? Remember, go back to history and evidence of this happening in your life before you jump to conclusions. Okay, the next thinking trap we can fall into is personalization. So you take your partner's behavior personally, like assuming your partner doesn't care about you if she doesn't do the dishes when they say she will. And wow, that was their example, not mine. I do not have an issue with my partner doing the dishes. That's something we agree on and we do, we do pretty well. But, I digress. So the next thinking trap in a relationship is all or nothing thinking. When you see things in black and white, things are all good or all bad. Just like, for an example, if you have an argument with your partner and you immediately think you're going to break up, that's not usually how that works out. Usually takes people a long time before that moment comes. So it's not black and white, and just try not to immediately jump to the worst case scenario. All right, the next thinking trap is labeling and mislabeling. So you're reducing your partner or your partner's behavior to a label that obscures all complexity or nuance. For example, your partner forgets to pay a bill and you conclude that he is worthless when it comes to financial matters. I would really hope this one might be a little easier to maintain and, have an alternative view on, because if they don't pay a bill, then, has there been a time that you forgot to pay a bill, or you forgot to walk the dog, or you forgot to do the dishes? So that one's a little easier to kind of get your head out of. But another thinking trap is tunnel vision. And tunnel vision is explained as focusing only on behavior that fits your assumptions and judgments about your partner. So, for example, you think your partner is selfish and therefore you only see selfish behavior, not all the generous things they're doing. So you're looking at from like a rose-colored lens, except the opposite. You're only seeing the bad stuff. You're never seeing the good stuff. And it's because it's feeding into your predetermined assumptions, which can happen when we have a lot of baggage. But it is important to remember that your partner is not your past. They are separate from your experiences. So you have to base all of your thoughts and feelings off of evidence of what your partner has done. Okay, so I'll go over the last two thinking traps in relationships, and the second to last is biased explanations. And that's assuming your partner has negative motives. So it's kind of like the tunnel vision one. The behavior kind of fits the assumptions. Well, in this one, it's like assuming they just have negative emotions, and that could be involved with tunnel vision. So, for example, you think your partner is being nice to you only because he wants something from you. Now, that's really intense. I hope you're not going through that, but hopefully you can have a conversation with your partner about their intentions if that really is the case, if you are thinking that. All right, and the last thinking trap for relationships is mind reading. So this is something we're all familiar with, but it's basically assuming you know what your partner is thinking without evidence for your assumption. And we can all go through this because it's easier to do than actually thinking out. Like, why would my partner do this? Like, I know why they would do this because of A, B, and C, except it's just helpful to actually ask them. So here's a way of challenging the thinking traps and actually like recognizing when you're doing them, because like I just said, a lot of times we don't recognize we're doing them. That's why they're traps. Okay, so here are the steps to challenging these thinking traps. The first step is identifying the situation. So what happened just before you had the strong emotional reaction? What were your emotions? Anxiety, anger, guilt, etc. Or is it a combination of these? And then once you identify the situation, you're going to rate the strength of your emotion. Then on a scale of 1 to 100, rate your emotional reaction. And I like that it gives you a large scale, because if it's like a 20 out of 100, if you do the math on that, that's not a lot. So is it worth bringing up? Is it worth discussing? So after you rate the strength of your emotion, you're going to identify the thought. So really articulate the thought or thoughts that accompanied your reaction. Something like, if you're upset your partner is on their phone too much, the feeling is being upset, but articulating the thought is, I'm upset that they're on their phone. Then you articulate the thinking trap. You look at the list of the thinking traps, or like go over this list of thinking traps that I've given you and identify if you've fallen into one. Are you catastrophizing? Is it all or nothing? Is it probability overestimation? Now, when I think about my partner's on their phone too much and it's because they're not interested in me, what thinking trap did I just do right there? Exactly. So I'm catastrophizing. I'm actually doing a lot of those in that statement. It's an overestimation. I'm mind reading. Like, those are a combination of a couple mind traps there. But essentially, when I come to a conclusion without evidence, that's when you're in a thinking trap. So after you identify the thinking trap, what you want to do is question the thought. So challenge the thought without arguing with yourself. Really give yourself space to say whatever you want to say, feel however you want to feel. And of course, this is all internal or in a journal with yourself. And you challenge the thought without arguing. And then gently and with curiosity, ask yourself the following questions. Do I have enough information to support my conclusion? What's the evidence for and against this thought? Is this thought a habit of mind? In other words, do I tend to think things like this in similar situations? Like if my partner doesn't do the dishes, is it the same thought I had when they're on their phone? They just don't want to spend time with me anymore. I'm just too boring. And then the last thought is to question, if the worst were to happen, how would I deal with it? And how have I dealt with situations like this before? Oh, and another question is, what would I tell a friend in the same situation? Like, what advice would I give that friend? But give it to yourself and be really honest. Like, if it's a really serious situation, this is a really good exercise to go through too, because you're basically just assessing, how important is this? Is there evidence to support it? Do I need to have a conversation? What would I tell my friend? All right. So once you question the thought, then you're going to generate alternative responses. So at the beginning of the episode, and what I just mentioned for thinking traps, is that there are alternative thoughts to how you can maybe see the situation in a different light. So once you challenge the thought, what you're going to do is generate alternative responses. So consider other possibilities and generate as many as you can to show yourself how many interpretations of the situation are actually possible. And then after you generate alternative responses, you're going to rate the strength of your emotion again and see if it's changed. If it's a small change, don't discount it. It's saying it's still a change. You're going in the right direction because you're starting to see your patterns and the control you have over whether or not you're going to react. So those are all the ways to challenge thinking traps. And I thought it was really important to make sure we go over those thinking traps because they're so common. And I swear to you, I know other people have these thoughts, but I didn't realize they were actually studied. Like, these are the thoughts that we have, like we overgeneralize or we're thinking in black and white. These are things that so many people have done that therapists have actually studied them, marked them as thinking traps, and then told us like how to challenge these thoughts and to have more productive like conflict resolution. And I thought that was really interesting because, like I said, we all have these thoughts. You're not alone. You're not crazy. You don't have too much baggage. You're just a human. And it's good to recognize that we all have these feelings and thoughts at some point. All right, so now I'm going to talk about specific exercises you and your partner can do to actually help you have positive conflict resolution. I got these exercises from the podcast. If you haven't noticed, there seems to be a theme here in all of my relationship podcasts of my own. I am reflecting on other podcasts I've listened to. But yes, the one I got this from is called Marriage Therapy Radio. And I mentioned them before. They did a variety YouTube video about different fictional characters that have relationships and kind of went through them and analyzed them. But anyways, they actually mentioned Brene Brown's podcast episode that I talked about earlier about getting it right versus being right. And then they give specific exercises that they give to their own clients to do to help reduce like conflict and to actually be a listener. And like I said, they listen to the Brene Brown episode and then they talk about getting it right versus being right. And they say that it's really important to have that mantra because people in conflict don't listen. And what Brene said is people don't listen because they feel shame. And shame is such like an egocentric feeling that you stop being able to be empathetic to the actual situation that your partner is going through. And you start reflecting on yourself, and that's where shame comes in. So on the Marriage Therapy Radio podcast, they're saying in order to be a good listener, what you have to do are these exercises to help you listen. And the first one is a stress-reducing conversation. And it teaches you how to be a good empathetic listener because this exercise teaches you how to have boundaries. So if you guys don't know what personal boundaries are, there is a list, and I was going to go through it, but it's a little long right now. So what you can do is actually just Google how to set personal boundaries and what healthy boundaries look like. And then it'll teach you kind of how to set boundaries when you're having a conversation with your partner. Because you don't only want to be listening to be right and to confirm your point of view. You want to relearn how to listen. And to do that, you put boundaries on what you need from your partner during a conversation. So let's say you are having an argument with your partner and you say, okay, I need some space right now. I need about an hour to think by myself. Those are my boundaries. Can you please respect those? And then you come back and maybe then you can start over with a soft opening, start the conflict over because maybe it didn't start well, and then you guys can have positive conflict resolution. Okay, so the next exercise is the notepad exercise. And in this exercise, what you're going to do is actually have a notepad with you. So let's say you guys start arguing. You're going to have a notepad with you. You're going to say, hey, here are my boundaries. I want to get my notepad. Please let me do this so I can actually listen to you. And you're only going to write down the words that are being said, and you're not going to respond. This gets you to refocus on what the actual conflict is versus how you're feeling. And it reteaches you how to listen, right? So you're not going to listen just to respond and just to get your point of view across. You're actually going to write down the words, look at the concern and the feelings that are expressed with those words. And then hopefully because you're reading it and you're taking the time to absorb, you actually respond to the issue. You don't respond with how you feel and how they're affecting you. You just kind of focus on the issue at hand. And I really like that. It's very practical. It's a little weird. When do we actually have notepads on us? But if it works, it works, I guess. So the last exercise I'll share with you guys is the multiple choice exercise. And this exercise is really focused towards the fixers, the partners who want to problem solve versus really look at your emotions. And I'm not going to gender stereotype. The therapist did say men tend to lean towards this, but that's based off of, environment and studies that they've done. So take that with it what you will, but if you're a fixer, you should really try this. Basically, the example that they used is if your partner complains about something in conversation, what you do instead of fixing it, coming up with your own conclusion, is to list off multiple choices and options about, the circumstance. Like, let's say your partner is upset that her friend isn't texting her back, and she's just trying to communicate to you her feelings. So you're not going to fix it, but you are trying to get to the root of the issue and be helpful as a partner. And because you like to come up with solutions, maybe come up with suggestions instead of solutions. So some of your suggestions to your partner who's having trouble with a friend might be like, oh, is she having troubles with her family? Is COVID really getting to her? Does she need help with the kids? Should we make her a meal? Like, what are suggestions, positive suggestions that you can make that might make her rethink the situation in general instead of trying to solve the problem for her? I think that's actually a really good solution for everyone to do, is maybe not fly off the cuff and say like, well, yeah, your friend's just like that. She's rude, or, she's always emotional. That's not really something I want to hear about a friend that I chose, that I respect and have so many reasons why they're my friend. I still like this person. They're just being mean to me in the moment, so I don't need to hear them disrespected. I just need to hear a suggestion to why they might be being mean to me other than the fact that I suck. So I really like this exercise that, it reminds us that we need to listen differently, and we need to not immediately jump to problem solving because our partner's upset. It's just reminding us that it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And again, that's super important to remember. It's how you fix the steps in shame, and you keep conflict positive versus negative. Okay, so I hope you guys liked this episode on how to fight smarter, because conflicts are going to happen, and now we kind of have conflict resolution in a positive way, whether that's recognizing our own discomfort and shame when we feel attacked, to how to start a positive conversation with a conflicting feeling you might have, or a conflict in the relationship in general. Oh, and recognizing, the thinking traps that may even start a fight. So I hope you guys liked that episode. And thanks again for joining us on the GSMC Relationship Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I hope to see you guys next time. Bye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.